The cold of the car window was a familiar ache against Sophia's cheek. At 7 years old, she understood aches. There was the ache in her joints when the air grew damp, the tired ache behind her eyes, and now this new, silent ache, filling the space between her and her mother. Elena drove with her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her jaw a tight line of unspoken words. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. A beautiful world that felt a million miles away. Sophia clutched the worn plush bear in her lap, its button eyes staring forward, brave in a way she couldn't be. She was a ghost in the passenger seat, her pale skin and shallow breaths a constant, quiet reminder of why they were driving into the night, away from everything she knew. They stopped in front of a small house with a single porch light cutting through the darkness. The engine died, and the silence that rushed in was louder than any shout. "Get your bag, Sophia," Eleanor said, her voice thin and brittle, like a leaf about to crumble. The suitcase was small, a faded blue with a peeling sticker of a smiling star. It held everything she owned. Elena walked her to the door but didn't knock. She knelt, her face a mask of something Sophia couldn't name, not anger, not sadness, but a terrifying emptiness. "Grandma will take care of you now. You'll be better here." The words were meant to be a comfort, but they landed like stones. A quick, cold kiss on her forehead, and then she was gone. The sound of the car door slamming was the sound of a lock turning forever. Sophia stood alone on the worn wooden porch, the tiny suitcase a heavy anchor at her side. The autumn wind bit at her exposed ankles and whispered through the thin fabric of her coat. She didn't move. She didn't cry. It was as if the cold had seeped past her skin and frozen her from the inside out, turning her heart into a fragile piece of ice. The world shrank to the circle of yellow light she stood in, a tiny, forgotten island in a vast, dark ocean. She stared at the closed door of the car as it pulled away, its red tail lights shrinking until they were just two angry pinpricks. And then nothing. How long does a child have to stand in the dark before she starts to believe she belongs there? The front door creaked open, revealing her grandmother, Isabel, whose face was a roadmap of worry and sorrow. She didn't say a word, just wrapped a frail but warm shawl around Sophia's shoulders and guided her inside. The house smelled of lavender and old wood, a scent of quiet love, but it couldn't penetrate the wall of shock that had formed around the little girl. Later, tucked into a strange bed with sheets that felt too stiff, Sophia stared at her own hands in the moonlight. They were so small, the veins a faint blue map beneath her translucent skin. A thought, sharp and cruel, pierced through her numbness. This is my fault. I am the reason she left. It was the moment a 7-year-old girl diagnosed herself as a burden. Have you ever felt like you were simply too much for someone to carry? She didn't sleep. Through the thin walls, she could hear the muffled, heartbreaking sound of her grandmother weeping. It was a sound of defeat, of a love that was not enough to fix what had been broken. Sophia lay perfectly still, a single tear finally escaping, tracing a cold path down her temple and into her hair. She had learned a lesson that no child should ever have to learn, that a mother's love wasn't a promise. It was a loan that could be called in at any time. She pulled the covers up to her chin, as if she could hide from the vast, empty space that had just opened up inside her. She just wanted to be loved. Was that too much to ask? To understand the shattered pieces of a mother, you must first see the weight that broke her. Elena was not a monster. She was a girl who became a mother too soon, shackled to a reality she was unequipped to handle. Her days were a relentless cycle of sterile hospital corridors, the sharp scent of antiseptic, and the low, constant hum of machines that kept her daughter alive. Every beep was a reminder of her failure. Every bill in the mail was a paper-thin scream of her inadequacy. She watched other women her age chase dreams, fall in love, live. But Elena's world had shrunk to the four walls of a pediatric ward, her youth dissolving under the harsh fluorescent lights. She loved Sophia with a fierce, primal terror, but that love was being crushed by the sheer, unending exhaustion of it all. The loneliness was a physical presence, a cold shadow that sat beside her in the waiting rooms and followed her home to their tiny, damp apartment. Friends stopped calling, their invitations to parties and dinners feeling like taunts from another universe. How could she explain the language of blood counts and infusion schedules? How could she share the bone-deep weariness that came from holding her daughter through nights of pain, her small body trembling with fever? Eleanor felt like a ghost haunting her own life, invisible to a world that celebrated strength and normalcy. She began to resent not her daughter, but the illness that had stolen both their lives, turning her into a warden and Sophia into a prisoner. Is there any loneliness more profound than suffering in a crowd? The final fracture came from a place of pure helplessness. It was the trauma of watching the person you love most in the world suffer, day after day, and being utterly powerless to stop it. Doctors spoke in a language of grim possibilities, their compassion buried under clinical detachment. Elena would smile for Sophia, read her stories with a steady voice. But inside, she was screaming. The feeling of impotence became a poison, seeping into her love and turning it into something bitter and resentful. She saw her daughter not as a child, but as a reflection of her own failure. Every time Sophia winced in pain, Eleanor felt a stab of guilt so sharp it stole her breath. What do you do when the only thing you can offer is a love that isn't enough? And so, a desperate, toxic lie began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. She would be better off without me. The thought started as a whisper, a defense against the crushing weight of her own despair. She convinced herself that her poverty, her exhaustion, her sorrow were the real sicknesses harming her child. She imagined a world where Sophia was cared for by people who weren't so broken, so tired. It was a cruel act of self-preservation disguised as sacrifice. Elena wasn't abandoning a burden. In her mind, she was freeing her daughter from one. She was the anchor, and she had to cut the rope. Have you ever had to believe a lie just to survive the truth? The drive away from her mother's house was the quietest scream of her life. The silence in the car was cavernous, a hollow space where Sophia's soft breathing used to be. For a fleeting moment, there was a gasp of relief, a terrifying lightness, but it was immediately swallowed by a wave of guilt so immense it felt like drowning. She saw her daughter's face in every passing streetlight, heard her name in the whisper of the wind. She hadn't escaped. She had only traded one prison for another, a cell with no bars, built from the memory of a small, trusting hand letting go of hers. The choice didn't save her. It simply shattered her into a million pieces, scattering them along a dark, empty road. In the years that followed, Elena drifted. She worked jobs that required no heart, lived in apartments that never felt like home. She built a wall of numbness around herself, but the ghost of Sophia was always there, a 7-year-old girl standing on a porch under a single yellow light. The abandonment didn't just break her daughter's heart, it hollowed out her own soul, leaving a void that no amount of time or distance could ever fill. She had run from the responsibility, from the pain, from the helplessness, only to discover she had been running from herself all along. And in the end, her greatest fear came true. She was utterly, completely alone. Would you have made a different choice in her place? The house smelled of lavender and regret, a combination that became the scent of Sophia's childhood. Her grandmother's love was a silent, fragile thing, found in a neatly folded blanket or a warm bowl of soup, but it could not fill the echoing cavern her mother had left behind. Days bled into one another in a grayscale routine. Wake up, feel the familiar ache in her joints, pretend to be stronger than she was for Isabel's sake, and go to sleep with the phantom weight of a goodbye kiss on her forehead. She was a ghost in a house of memories, learning that the deepest kind of loneliness isn't being alone, but being surrounded by a love that is powerless to heal your deepest wound. Her body was a battlefield she never chose. Mornings were the cruelest, when the dull throb in her bones was a constant reminder of her own fragility. She learned to map the pain, to give its different shades names only she understood. The sharp, biting pain was the glass, the heavy, tired ache was the stone. She would press her face into the cold pillow, biting back a whimper, because her grandmother's worried eyes were a heavier burden than the illness itself. Other children woke up and thought of games to play. Sophia woke up and calculated how much energy she had just to make it to the kitchen. How does a child explain a pain that feels 100 years old? The schoolyard was another kind of wilderness, and she was the wounded animal the pack kept its distance from, while other children screamed with laughter, chasing balls and each other under the pale sun. Sophia sat on the cold metal of the bench, a permanent fixture. She became an expert in the language of whispers, catching fragments of the sick girl, or the one whose mom left. Pity was a wall, and curiosity was a weapon. She wasn't a classmate. She was a cautionary tale. She held her books to her chest like a shield, pretending to be lost in their pages. But she saw everything. Have you ever felt more alone in a crowd than you do in an empty room? Dinner was a ritual of silence. Isabel would place a plate of simple food before her, her hands wrinkled and trembling slightly. The love was in the gesture, but the conversation was strained, filled with questions Isabel was too afraid to ask, and answers Sophia was too tired to give. The empty chair at their small table was a constant, screaming presence. It was where her mother should have been. Sophia would push the food around her plate, the gnawing hunger in her stomach eclipsed by the cavernous hunger in her heart. She missed her mother with a physical ache, a longing so profound it stole her appetite and her breath. Can you remember a time when your sadness was too big for your body to hold? Night was when the monsters came out. Not the ones under the bed, but the ones inside her head. In the suffocating quiet of her small room, the questions would loop endlessly. Was I too much trouble? Was my sickness too ugly? Why wasn't I enough to make her stay? She would curl into a tight ball, wrapping her arms around herself because there was no one else to do it. The tears she held back all day would finally fall, silent and hot against her pillow, careful not to make a sound that might wake her grandmother. The fear of being a burden was a heavier blanket than the one that covered her. What do you do when the person you need most is the one you're most afraid of disappointing? She saw the exhaustion etched into her grandmother's face, in the slump of her shoulders after a long day. She saw the worn-out purse, the careful way Isabel would count out coins at the pharmacy, her lips moving silently. The guilt was a physical weight in Sophia's chest, so she began to lie. "I'm fine, Grandma," she'd say, forcing a smile while the glass pain shot through her legs. "It doesn't hurt today." She became a performer in a one-person play, hiding her symptoms, minimizing her needs, all to erase the worry from the only person she had left. Is there any burden heavier than watching someone you love sacrifice everything for you? Her 8th birthday arrived without fanfare. Isabel managed to bake a small lopsided cake, its sugary frosting unable to sweeten the bitterness in the air. There were no friends, no colorful balloons, just the two of them at the kitchen table. As Isabel sang a wavering, lonely version of Happy Birthday, Sophia stared at the single flickering candle. She closed her eyes and wished with every fiber of her being for the front door to open, for her mother's voice to call her name. The wish dissolved into the silence that followed the song. She smiled, thanked her grandmother, and ate the cake, each bite tasting of ash. Have you ever had to smile when your heart was breaking? The girl in the mirror was a stranger, pale skin stretched thin over delicate bones, and dark, bruised circles under her eyes that made her look like a tiny, tired owl. She would trace the faint network of blue veins on her wrists, seeing them not as signs of life, but as proof of her defect. This body, this fragile, aching thing was the reason. It was the flaw that had made her mother run. The word unlovable took root in her soul, a poisonous seed planted by the person who was supposed to teach her what love was. How do you learn to love yourself when you believe you were born broken? She tried to hold on to the good memories, but they were fading, growing transparent with time. The warmth of her mother's hand, the scent of her perfume, the sound of a lullaby sung off-key, these images were becoming blurry, losing their color. The one memory that remained in sharp, vivid detail was the image of the car driving away, its red tail lights like two angry eyes disappearing into the darkness. The trauma was a scar that refused to fade, while the love that came before it felt like a dream she might have invented. If you lost everything, which single memory would you fight the hardest to keep? From her bedroom window, the world outside looked like a movie she wasn't allowed to be in. She watched fathers pushing their daughters on swings, their laughter carrying on the wind. She saw mothers holding their children's hands, walking home from school. These ordinary moments of affection were like dispatches from another universe, a world where love was easy and reliable. The window pane was cold against her forehead, a clear, invisible barrier separating her reality of loss from their reality of belonging. We often don't realize the value of a simple hug until it's all we truly want. And so, Sophia built a fortress of silence. It was her only defense. She learned to swallow her pain, to bury her needs, to ask for nothing. She became a quiet observer of life, a shadow moving through rooms, careful not to take up too much space. Her heart didn't turn to stone. It simply went into hiding, deep within the fortress walls where no one could reach it, and no one could abandon it again. She accepted her fate, a quiet resignation to a life defined by what she lacked. If you had seen that little girl slowly disappearing behind her own walls, what would you have said to her? The change began not with a miracle, but with a crisis. It was a Tuesday when the pain, the stone pain, became so heavy she couldn't breathe. The hospital was the same sterile white, the same smell of fear and antiseptic, but this time, a new doctor walked in. His name was Marcus Thorne, and his eyes were different. They didn't hold pity. They held a quiet, intense curiosity. While others saw a frail child, a list of symptoms on a chart, he saw a mind working behind the tired gaze. He pulled up a chair, not to examine her, but to talk to her. "Tell me what it feels like," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Not the medical terms, in your words." For the first time, someone wasn't just looking at her illness, they were looking at her. How often do we forget that behind every diagnosis, there is a person waiting to be seen? That one question unlocked a door Sophia thought was sealed forever. She began to speak, her small voice hesitant at first, describing the glass and the stone. "Doctor." Thorne listened, nodding, sketching diagrams on a notepad. He didn't use baby talk. He used words like hematology and cellular morphology, explaining them with a respect that made her feel intelligent, not broken. He saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes, the hunger for answers. Before he left, he placed a thick, worn textbook on her bedside table. Principles of Cellular Biology. It wasn't a get-well gift. It was an invitation. It was a silent declaration that she was more than a patient. She was a mind capable of understanding her own battle. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to hand you a new story to read about yourself. Back in her small room, the book became her sanctuary. The complex diagrams and dense paragraphs were not intimidating. They were a map of her own inner world. She learned the names of the cells that betrayed her, the proteins that failed to form correctly. The knowledge didn't take away the pain, but it organized it. It transformed the faceless monster under her bed into a tangible, scientific problem. She would lie awake at night, not crying, but tracing the pathways of her own bloodstream in her mind. Her loneliness didn't disappear, but it was now shared with a new companion, a fierce, burning curiosity. She was no longer just a victim of her body. She was its most dedicated student. Have you ever found a refuge in a place no one else would think to look? Her follow-up appointments with Dr. Thorne became the highlight of her life. They were less like examinations and more like private tutorials. After the nurses left, he would sometimes lead her to the quiet hum of the research lab. Surrounded by the cool steel of microscopes and the scent of ethanol, Sophia felt a sense of belonging she had never known. He showed her a slide of her own blood, magnified 1,000 times. She saw them then, the misshapen, fragile cells, the source of all her suffering. But looking at them through the lens, they weren't terrifying. They were a puzzle, a question, waiting for an answer. The little girl who was once defined by her weakness was now staring at its very essence, not with fear, but with the focused gaze of a future scientist. The whispers in the schoolyard began to lose their power. The label of the sick girl felt like a coat that no longer fit. A new identity was being woven inside her, thread by thread. The biologist, the researcher, the one who understood the secret language her own body was speaking. She still sat on the bench alone, but her solitude was now filled with thought, her mind racing with questions about genetic codes and protein folding. Her grandmother noticed the shift. The quiet resignation in Sophia's eyes was being replaced by a spark of intense focus. The hope was small, a fragile seedling pushing through concrete, but it was there. It was the radical belief that she could be more than just her pain. Sometimes, all a child needs is for one person to say, "I believe in you." Who was that person in your life? The future, once a terrifying grey fog, began to take shape. It had the bright, clear lines of a laboratory, the weight of a white coat, the promise of a life with purpose. Dr. Thorne spoke to her of universities and scholarships, not as distant dreams, but as achievable steps on a path. He helped her reframe her entire existence. Her illness was not a curse, it was her unique qualification. Who could be more motivated to find answers than someone who lived the question every single day? The pain was still there, a constant, dull ache in the background. But it was no longer her identity. It was now her fuel. The girl who was left behind because she was seen as a flaw was beginning to realize that her greatest wound could become her greatest strength. She was rejected for the body she was given. But what if that very body was her key to changing the world? The transition from a wounded child to a determined young scientist was not a straight line. It was a treacherous climb with loose rocks and sudden drops. The first major fall happened during her freshman year of college. The world of advanced genetics was a vast, unforgiving ocean, and for the first time, Sophia felt herself drowning. A particularly complex thesis on gene splicing therapies became her personal Everest. Night after night, the equations blurred, the data refused to align, and the solution remained just out of reach. A dismissive comment from a professor. "Perhaps this is too ambitious for your background," it was all it took. The old toxic whisper returned, slithering into her thoughts. "You're not smart enough. You're flawed." The praise from Dr. Thorne suddenly felt like a lie, a kindness offered to a broken thing. Have you ever worked so hard only to feel like a complete imposter? As her confidence crumbled, her body followed. The stress triggered a severe flare-up, the worst she had experienced in years. The familiar, sterile white of a hospital room became her world once more, the scent of antiseptic, a cruel reminder of the identity she fought so hard to escape. She was no longer Sophia, the promising researcher. She was just a patient, a collection of symptoms on a chart. Her textbooks sat on the bedside table, their covers mocking her with the promise of a future that felt impossible from this bed. The stone pain was back, heavy and relentless, and it crushed her spirit as much as it ached in her bones. How can you fight for a future when your own body is dragging you back into the past? The whispers of the schoolyard had followed her, evolving into the sophisticated cruelty of academic rivalry. Another student, vying for the same research grant, made a cutting remark in a crowded hallway. Of course, Thorne favors her. It's a great story, isn't it? The sick girl he saved. The words were a poison dart, striking the most vulnerable part of her, the fear that her mentor's belief in her was rooted in pity, not merit. The accusation tainted everything, turning his kindness into a condescending pat on the head. She felt the old walls of isolation closing in, separating her from her peers. She wasn't one of them. She was a project, a tragedy, a story to be told. Is there any pain more isolating than having your greatest strength be seen as your biggest weakness? In the suffocating silence of the hospital night, a ghost she thought she had buried returned. A profound, aching longing for her mother washed over her. It wasn't a desire for Elena, the woman who had left her on a porch. It was a primal, childish need for a mom. A soft voice, a cool hand on a feverish forehead, the unconditional comfort she had only read about in books. She hated herself for this weakness, this betrayal of her own hard-won independence. How could she miss the architect of her deepest pain? The conflict was a quiet war waged within her, leaving her exhausted and more alone than ever. Is it possible to grieve for a love you never truly had? Poisoned by doubt, Sophia began to push Dr. Thorne away. His concerned calls went to voicemail. His texts remained unanswered. She fabricated excuses to miss their scheduled meetings. In her mind, she was testing him, waiting for the moment he would finally give up on her, proving the cruel whispers were right. It was a subconscious act of self-destruction, a tragic reenactment of her core trauma. If she pushed away the one person who saw her value, she could control the inevitable abandonment, making it her choice this time. She was preparing for the heartbreak she was certain was coming, building the walls of her fortress higher and stronger than ever before. Have you ever pushed someone away just to see if they would fight to stay? Her grandmother, Isabel, saw the vibrant light in Sophia's eyes fade to a dull, grey emptiness. She found her granddaughter staring out the window for hours, the ambitious fire she once had reduced to cold ash. One evening, Isabel sat beside her, her voice soft but laced with a rare, steely resolve. "I have watched you fight your body your entire life," she said, her wrinkled hand covering Sophia's. "That is a noble fight. But fighting yourself, that is a waste of the miracle you are." She spoke of the quiet sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the unwavering hope she had held on to. To give up now is to tell that little girl on the porch that she was right to feel worthless. The words weren't an accusation. They were a mirror, reflecting a truth Sophia had refused to see. This was her rock bottom. The combined weight of failure, sickness, and doubt became unbearable. She packed a small bag one night, the faded blue suitcase a haunting echo of the one she carried as a child. She was going to quit the program, disappear, and free everyone from the burden she was convinced she had become. In the mirror, she didn't see a 20-year-old woman. She saw a pale, fragile 7-year-old, her eyes hollow with the certainty that her mother had been right all along. She was a defect, a mistake. She picked up the thick biology textbook Dr. Thorne had given her all those years ago. Its worn cover, a symbol of a dream that had died. Have you ever stood on the edge, ready to let go of everything you ever wanted? Her fingers brushed against the embossed title, the feel of the letters a faint spark in the darkness. On impulse, she opened the book. It fell open to a diagram of a complex hemoglobin molecule, its intricate, spiraling chains a thing of impossible beauty. She remembered spending weeks trying to understand it, the frustration, and then the sudden, brilliant flash of comprehension. In that moment, staring at the architecture of life itself, the pilot light of her curiosity flickered back on. To run away now would be to surrender to the chaos, to let her mother's narrative be the final word. To stay meant fighting for a different ending. This choice wasn't for her grandmother or for Dr. Thorne. It was for the little girl in the mirror. She left the packed bag on the floor and walked out of the house, clutching the book like a shield. The campus was dark and quiet, but the lab was her true home. She let herself in, the low hum of the freezers a comforting sound. She sat at her station, switched on the microscope, and placed a slide of her own blood under the lens. The familiar, misshapen cells filled the view. They were flawed, they were fragile, but they were hers, and they were still fighting. A wave of clarity washed over her. She was not her mother's rejection. She was not her illness. She was the one who was going to find the answers. She fell, but something inside her, forged in years of silent pain, would not let her stay on the ground. Her voice was steady when she called Dr. Thorne. "Marcus," she said, "I think I know where I went wrong. I have a new theory." The auditorium was filled with the low murmur of anticipation. A sea of faces turned toward the stage. At the podium stood a woman of 20, her posture radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence, Dr. Sophia Thorne. The name felt solid, earned. Her white lab coat was not a costume, but a second skin, a testament to 13 years spent turning pain into knowledge. She was presenting her team's breakthrough research on targeted gene therapies for rare hematological disorders. As she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, weaving complex scientific data into a narrative of hope. She was no longer the fragile girl defined by her illness. She was the woman redefining its future. From the back of the room, a figure watched, a ghost unseen in the crowd. Elena had been drawn here by a flyer for a public medical lecture, a last-ditch effort to understand the disease that was now ravaging her own body. The name of the lead researcher, Dr. Thorne, meant nothing to her. She was just a woman haunted by the past, her body now paying the price for a genetic flaw she had passed on. She looked older than her years, the lines on her face etched by regret, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn-out purse. She listened to the brilliant young scientist on stage, feeling a strange mix of awe and despair. The speaker was everything she was not: strong, purposeful, a beacon of light against the darkness Elena had chosen to live in. As the presentation concluded, the screen behind Sophia displayed a photograph, a grainy, faded image of a 7-year-old girl with enormous, sad eyes, sitting on a hospital bed. "This research is not just academic," Sophia's voice rang out, steady and strong. "It is personal. It is for every child who was ever made to feel that their body was a burden." In that instant, the world stopped for Eleanor. The face on the screen was a ghost from a locked room in her memory. The brilliant doctor at the podium was the fragile child she had left on a porch 13 years ago. The air left her lungs in a silent, suffocating gasp. The burden had become a miracle, and she had thrown it away. The applause was thunderous, but Eleanor couldn't hear it. The only sound was the frantic, panicked beating of her own heart. She saw it all in a flash: the small suitcase, the red tail lights disappearing into the night, the years of hollow silence. She had run from a sick child, only to find herself at the mercy of the woman that child had become. After the lecture, Eleanor stumbled toward the stage, a moth drawn to a flame that would surely burn her. Sophia was surrounded by colleagues, her smile genuine and bright. Then, her eyes met Elena's across the small crowd. The smile didn't vanish. It froze, replaced by a mask of calm, professional neutrality that was colder than any hatred. Have you ever seen your biggest mistake standing before you, whole and powerful? Can I help you? Sophia asked, her voice devoid of any recognition, as if speaking to a complete stranger. The words were a clean, surgical cut. Elena opened her mouth, but no sound came out. What could she say? I'm your mother. I'm sorry. I'm dying. All the excuses she had rehearsed in her mind for over a decade turned to ash on her tongue. She was looking at her daughter, but she was a foreigner in her life, a relic from a past Sophia had clearly survived, and even conquered. The power dynamic had been shattered and rebuilt. The little girl who once waited for her mother to come back was gone. In her place stood a woman who clearly needed nothing from her. Elena finally managed to speak, her voice a ragged whisper. I'm sick. They told me. They said you were the only hope. The confession was a surrender, a final, desperate plea. Sophia's expression remained unchanged, her gaze analytical, like a scientist studying a specimen. She saw a woman consumed by fear and illness, the same fear she had lived with her entire life. But there was no pity in her eyes, only a profound as echoing silence. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, in angry daydreams, in tearful nights, but the reality was quiet, sterile, and utterly devastating. The confrontation she had braced for was not a storm, but a chilling calm. Would you forgive in this situation? The little girl inside Sophia, the one who cried herself to sleep, wanted to scream. She wanted to unleash 13 years of rage and abandonment. But the woman she had become did something far more powerful. She simply nodded, her composure absolute. Dr. Marcus Thorne handles all new patient intakes. His office is down the hall. They will take your information and see if you qualify for the trial. She treated her not as a mother, not as a monster, but as a case file, a problem to be solved with science, not with emotion. This clinical detachment was her victory. It was a declaration that Elena no longer had the power to hurt her. Stunned into silence, Elena could only stare. She saw the strength in her daughter's eyes, a resilience forged in the very fires of the abandonment she had inflicted. She saw the life that had flourished, not just in spite of her, but because of her absence. She had left behind what she thought was a broken thing, only to discover it was a seed, and it had grown into something magnificent without her. The shame was a physical weight, crushing her, making it hard to breathe. She was the flaw, she was the burden. She had recognized her daughter far, far too late. Sophia watched her for a moment longer, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not hatred, but a final, quiet assessment. Then she turned away, back to her colleagues, back to her life, back to the world she had built from the rubble of the one Elena had destroyed. The power had not just shifted, it had been reclaimed. Elena was left alone in the crowd, a ghost in her daughter's triumph. The little girl she had left in the dark was now the one who controlled the light, and Elena was just a shadow, begging for a sliver of it to survive. What do you do when your only hope for a future is the past you tried to erase? Sophia did not feel triumph as she walked away from the shell of the woman who was her mother. She felt a quiet, clinical finality. The decision to accept Elena into the trial was not born of forgiveness, nor was it an act of elaborate revenge. It was a testament to the person she had become, a doctor whose oath transcended the wounds of a child. She would treat the disease, not the person. Her heart, the one that had ached for a mother's love for so long, was now a protected, professional space. The little girl who cried in the dark would not be making this choice. The scientist who found salvation in logic would. Have you ever had to make a decision where your professional duty and your deepest personal pain pulled you in two completely opposite directions? In the sterile, white-walled treatment center, Elena became a number on a chart, a set of data points on a screen. Patient 37. Sophia oversaw her treatment with the same meticulous, detached precision she applied to every case. She reviewed blood work, adjusted dosages, and spoke to Elena in the calm, measured tones of a physician, her eyes focused on the chart in her hands, never on the face haunted by regret. There were no tears, no accusations, no dramatic confrontations. There was only the low hum of medical equipment, the smell of saline, and the steady drip of an IV bag delivering a future Elena did not deserve, from a daughter she did not raise. How do you face someone who shattered your world, when you are the only one who can piece theirs back together? For Elena, every day was a quiet torture. The life-saving medicine flowing into her veins felt like poison, each drop a liquid reminder of her failure. She saw the respect in the eyes of the nurses as they spoke of Dr. Thorne, the brilliant young mind leading this revolutionary work. She saw the photographs in the hospital lobby of Sophia accepting awards, her smile radiant and full. This was the life she had thrown away, the daughter she had deemed a burden. She was being saved by a ghost, healed by the very legacy of the pain she had created. Her body was mending while her soul disintegrated, realizing that the cruelest punishment wasn't dying, but being forced to live with the full, unbearable weight of what she had lost. Sophia's purpose, however, extended far beyond the walls of patient 37's room. Her true work was found in the late hours in the lab, chasing anomalies in a genetic sequence, and in the quiet moments she spent with other children in the pediatric ward. She would sit on the edge of their beds, not as a doctor, but as a survivor, explaining their conditions with simple diagrams, just as Marcus had once done for her. She saw herself in their wide, fearful eyes and made a silent promise to each of them. You will be seen, you will be understood, and you will never be defined by your diagnosis. She was transforming her personal pain into a universal shield for others. Isn't it remarkable how our deepest wounds can become the very source of our greatest power to heal? Months later, the trial was a success. Elena was in remission, a medical miracle. There was no tearful reunion, no grand scene of forgiveness. Their final interaction was a discharge meeting, as clinical as their first. Sophia explained the follow-up protocol, handed over the paperwork, and wished her well with the same polite detachment she would offer any patient. In that moment, Sophia felt a profound sense of peace. She no longer needed an apology. She no longer needed a mother. Her life was full, her purpose clear, and her worth was something she had built herself, forged in silence and study. The chains of that long-ago abandonment didn't shatter. They simply dissolved, their power gone. What does it truly mean to be free from your past? Is it about forgiving, or is it about finally becoming indifferent to the one who hurt you? The final image of Sophia is not of her facing her mother, but of her standing before a new generation of researchers, a mentor now herself. The fragile girl left shivering on a porch had learned to generate her own warmth. The floor her mother ran from became the very code she learned to rewrite, not just in her own body, but for humanity. She didn't erase the memory of the little girl with the worn plush bear. She honored her by building a world where no child would ever have to feel like a burden again. She was rejected by the one who was supposed to love her most, but in return, she was embraced by the entire world she chose to heal. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to bring more powerful stories of resilience to light. Give this video a like if you believe in the power of the human spirit, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that our beginnings do not have to define our endings.